Welcome back to Behind the Counter, Pharmacy and Beyond, the podcast where real stories meet real business lessons. I'm your host, Solomon Abuede. If this is the first time listening, welcome. This podcast isn't about theory or fancy business talk. It's about real stuff, the challenges, the wins, the lessons I've learned from actually running a pharmacy business. In the last episode, I opened up about my toughest year in business and the realities that forced me to rethink everything we built. I've had some honest feedback since then. A few listeners said it didn't go deep enough and they expected more detail. And I get that. Recording that episode was raw and I think the emotion of it took over. But I've taken that feedback on board and in this episode, I've broken things down properly. We're going deeper and my hope is that you walk away with lessons that are not just real but actually useful and actionable. Today's episode is all about what happens when you decide or are forced to sell your pharmacy. And if you say decide or forced for a reason, because there's a big difference between the two. When you make the decision to sell, you're usually in control, or at least you should be, with time and options to plan properly and position yourself for a strong exit. But when you're forced to sell, it's a different story. That pressure might come from the bank, from a sudden health scare, or from the business simply not making ends meet anymore. Whether you're choosing to sell or being pushed into it, steps you need to take are surprisingly similar. There are a few key differences, and I'll break those down for you in this episode. By the end of this episode, you'll know what to expect emotionally and practically when selling a pharmacy, why your valuation might not reflect the work you've put in, what can derail a sale and how to avoid those pitfalls, how to prepare your business for sale even if you're not ready yet. And finally, why the way you sell matters just as much as who you sell to. So whether you're years away from selling or you're already halfway down the road, this episode is packed with insights that could save you time, money, and a lot of stress. The title says it all, Selling a Pharmacy, what no one tells you about the process. And trust me, there's a lot they don't tell you. So let's get into it. Selling was never part of the plan. At least, not for us. If I'm being completely honest, I never imagined selling anything. We were builders. The goal was always to grow, open more branches, create more impact, and build a legacy. Selling just didn't fit into that picture for us. But over time, I've come to realize something important. Selling is actually part of building a business. It's like stacking bricks. Sometimes they fall. Sometimes you have to stop, step back, and rework the foundation. Selling isn't necessarily a setback. Sometimes it's a strategic step back so you can move forward. The real difference comes down to the timing and the mindset. When you plan to sell, you're in control. It feels like a calculated, strategic move. You're in the driving seat. But when you're forced to sell, whether it's due to pressure from the bank, the personal health scare, or the business simply not making ends meet, it can feel like everything is falling apart. And yet, some of the most powerful lessons in business come from those moments. The first ones, they stretch you, they humble you. And if you survive, and you will survive, you come out stronger, more tenacious, more resilient, and a better business owner. Ironically, it was that same growth mindset we'd had from the beginning, the same ambition to build something bigger that eventually led us to the decision to sell. If you've listened to the last episode, you'll already know some of the backstory and how things started to unravel and why we were backed into a corner. If you haven't, I'd really encourage you to go back and listen to it. It provides important context that links directly to this story. The truth is, we were ambitious. We grew quickly. Probably too quickly, and we didn't have the right infrastructure or systems in place to support that growth. At the time, it all felt exciting. New branches, new opportunities, momentum, but beneath the surface, we hadn't laid the foundation to sustain that scale. I remember standing in one of the branches one afternoon, right in the middle of the chaos caused by not being able to supply the full medications to the patient. One customer after another came in, asking for their prescriptions, and each time I overheard the staff telling them, it's the new owner's fault. It's because of the changes they've made. In that moment, something hit me. I realized this wasn't just a bad day. The culture wasn't right. The team weren't aligned. And deep down, I knew something was seriously wrong. And when the cracks began to show, the pressure of holding it all together became overwhelming. That's when the conversation around selling first started. Not because we wanted to let go, but because we realized that if we didn't act fast, there might not be anything left to sell. The idea became real when we found ourselves struggling with two of our branches. There were new startups. There were acquisitions we had made with big hopes. But despite our best efforts, we just couldn't make them work. They weren't delivering the profits we expected. Worse still, there was no clear path to turning things around, and I think that was the crucial moment for me. We had strong competitors nearby. It felt like the longer we waited, the more ground we'd lose, until there was nothing of value left. That was the turning point, the fact that we didn't see a light at the end of the tunnel and no end in sight. We had what felt like a mass exodus of patients moving from our branch to the pharmacy across the road. It was bad, really bad. The item count was dropping, and the numbers told the story loud and clear. I remember standing there watching customers walk past our doors to go next door, and thinking, we're going to lose everyone if this carries on. We'll lose it all. I saw customers that were our patients walking past our door to go to the other pharmacy. And even then, even as the numbers were staring us in the face, I wasn't emotionally ready to sell. It felt like a failure, like we were giving up too soon. We'd only had those branches for just over a year when the idea of selling started to float around. It wasn't a desperate decision yet, but it was heading there quickly, and I could see that. We made a call just before things became critical. At the time, I naively thought selling would be straightforward. After all, it's just the reverse of buying, right? Well, I was wrong. What I quickly learned is that the stakes are much, much higher when you're the one letting go. When you're buying and a deal falls through, it's disappointing, but it's not the end of the world. You move on, you find another pharmacy. You haven't really lost anything except time and perhaps a little bit of money in solicitor's cost or perhaps a deposit. But when you're selling and a deal falls through, that's a different story. It can set you back months. You lose momentum. You often have to start the entire process again from scratch. And depending on how you're selling, that delay can be incredibly costly, emotionally, financially, and operationally. But here's what I've come to believe, and I say this from experience. No matter how tough it gets, there's always a way through. And you need to remember that. I remember staring at our monthly figures late one night. The numbers didn't make sense. Expenses were climbing. Margins were tightening. And I just sat there thinking, is this how it ends? After everything we'd built. Even if it feels like that in the moment, there is light at the end of the tunnel. You just have to keep believing, trust the process, and keep going. Let's get into the real heart of this episode. What nobody tells you, and what I wish someone had told me, is just how much goes into selling a pharmacy. The process, the emotion, the legal complexities, the delays. It's a beast. It's huge. On the surface, you might think that selling is simply the opposite of buying, but it's not that simple. If you've never done it before, it can be incredibly daunting and overwhelming. There are legal responsibilities you may not be prepared for. You'll be asked to complete extensive due diligence, and some of those questions feel more like you're filling out a police report than selling a business. And here's the part that caught me off guard. You may have a solicitor working on the deal, but ultimately you are the seller. You're responsible for everything that goes into those legal documents. They may draft the paperwork, but you're the one signing off. If a mistake is made, even unintentionally, the consequences fall on you. It's stressful, and that's the reality. You're a pharmacist, not a lawyer, but suddenly you're knee-deep in declarations, warranties, liabilities, and contracts, while still trying to run your business. Then there's the emotional side, the waiting, the uncertainty. You've listed your pharmacy, maybe you even found a buyer. But the truth is, until the deal is done, until contracts are exchanged, signed, anything can still happen. And when you're selling under financial pressure, that uncertainty carries even more weight. Every delay feels personal. Every unanswered email triggers anxiety. You're carrying the business on one shoulder and the pressure of the sale on another. That's the part no one prepares you for. And that's why I'm here sharing it now. Even though we didn't build these branches from scratch, the emotional weight of selling them was real. It felt like we're throwing in the towel, like we hadn't fought hard enough. And for me, personally, I'm not someone who gives up easily. So this felt exactly like that, like giving up. And I know that's the case for many business owners I've worked with. That's often the first big hurdle to cross, the emotional one. You tell yourself, I can turn this around. I can trade through this. And sometimes that belief is a good thing. It shows resilience, but it can also be dangerous, very dangerous. That mindset can trap you. You might think you're still swimming, but in reality, you're actually sinking. I've experienced that feeling, literally. I remember on holiday once in the sea, thinking I was swimming fine, but I wasn't. I was being dragged out by the current, completely unaware, until my wife grabbed me and pulled me back to safety. That's what it can feel like when you're stuck in a failing business. You're so deep in it, you can't see it clearly. You don't realize you're drifting until someone pulls you out. Knowing when to let go is a crucial moment in business. And my advice, don't make that decision alone. Speak to people who aren't emotionally tied to the business. People who can see things objectively for what they really are. Because that clarity, that emotional detachment can save you. You have to remind yourself, you're not quitting the fight. You're just choosing to live to fight another day. Even after we've made a decision to sell, we move slowly, almost like we were in a trance. We weren't rushing to market, just going through the motions. But the moment it became real was when we instructed the agent and signed the paperwork. That signature hit differently. I remember coming home and saying to my wife, it's done. I've signed. The pharmacies have been listed for sale. It was a heavy moment for both of us. A realization that it was no longer just an idea. It was happening. And then a few days later, the agent emailed the information memorandum. That was the next gut punch. Seeing your business packaged into a brochure, being marketed, it's surreal. Did I second guess it? Absolutely. Of course I did. I knew it was the right move, but emotionally I wrestled with it for weeks. Then comes the moment you find a buyer and the real work begins. They will instruct evaluation. And this is where things start to get interesting. Because, as they say, numbers don't lie, but they definitely do surprise you. We had a figure in mind based on what we believed the business was worth. Our agent had done a really good job, reviewed our accounts, and gave us a valuation based on market trends, recent sales, and turnover. You can accept that figure, or you can go slightly higher or lower. It's totally up to you. But ultimately, that's your valuation as the seller and what you say you want from it. What no one tells you is that the buyer has their own valuation process, and you may know this already, but do you know how it really works? It's completely different to how the valuation of the seller works. How the agent may give you a guide price based on turnover, from something like 85 to 120% of the annual revenue. The buyer's valuation is far more cautious and honestly, a lot more brutal. It's not based on your perception of the business. It's based on net profit, sustainability, and worst-case assumptions. And this is where things start to feel personal because you've spent years building this thing. You've sacrificed time, energy, weekends, and sleep. You've grown services, served your community, and innovated. But suddenly, it feels like none of that counts for much because the buyer's valuation isn't there to reward your hard work. It's there to protect them and their lender. I remember when we had our first valuation on our original pharmacy, the one we started from scratch. We were preparing to acquire a second branch and needed to know what our existing business was worth. The number came back and I was stunned. In that moment, I found myself thinking, what was the point of the last 7 years? The sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the missed holidays, 100-hour weeks. It felt like none of it had translated into value on paper. But that experience taught me something priceless. It forced me to step back and really understand how pharmacy valuations work. And that understanding is absolutely crucial. Once I figured it out and started applying what I'd learned, everything changed. By the time we went through the process again, just 18 months later, when acquiring the Scarborough branches, the valuation at the same pharmacy had almost doubled. Same location, same team. The only difference was that I now understood how to position the business and prepare for valuation properly. Some of the blind spots we had and what stung even more at the time was that our private services, which was strong at the time, wasn't properly factored into the valuation. We built a profitable private services arm of the business, from prescribing to travel health, and it was a big part of our revenue. But when the valuer looked at the books, that entire stream was downplayed or practically ignored. It wasn't considered standard in the sector, so they didn't see it as repeatable or sustainable. It was frustrating, to say the least. For me, that was a real turning point. It was the moment I realized that what you see as valuable and what buyers see as valuable are often two very different things. When you're selling, buyer and the bank aren't interested in your best year. They're not looking at what you can do with the business. They're asking, what will this business likely do in the hands of an average contractor? That's where the fair maintainable trade comes in. Fair maintainable trade is the industry's standard valuation method used by professional valuers to determine long-term sustainable profit, not peak performances, but maintainable performance. Here is how it works. 1. They strip out all anomalies, anything considered non-repeatable or too unique to you, like private services, prescribing income, or one-off windfalls. 2. They apply sector norms, things like standardized gross profit margins, market rate salaries, and average operating costs. 3. They calculate the fair maintainable operating profit. This is the profit that a reasonably efficient operator could be expected to achieve. And 4. They apply a multiplier, usually between 3 and 6, depending on the business. 100-hour pharmacies tend to attract lower multiples than standard-hour pharmacies. Now, here's where it gets painful. Even though we were achieving gross profit margins of over 40% at the time, the valuer adjusted it down to 30% because that was the sector benchmark. Let me explain that. This is what that means. If your pharmacy is turning over £500,000, for example, a 10% margin drop means £50,000 less profit used in the valuation. And if the multiplier is 4 times, that's a £200,000 drop in value, just from that one assumption. As mentioned earlier, private services are often excluded, seen as non-transferable and dependent on you. So even if they're profitable, they may not be counted in your valuation at all. And that's why we started Daughter Consulting, to help pharmacy owners, buyers, and sellers navigate this process with their eyes wide open. Valuation doesn't have to be a mystery, but it does require understanding how the game is played and how to prepare your business for it. The fair maintainable trade doesn't just reduce your gross profit margin. It also forces you to confront another uncomfortable truth, your own role in the business. If you're working in the business and not paying yourself proper pharmacy salary, the valuer will deduct one anyway. Around £65,000 for the average standard-hour pharmacy, that's including national insurance and pension. Why? Because they assume the buyer would need to replace you. That alone can dramatically reduce your fair maintainable operating profit, even if your P&Ls look great on paper. I challenged this at the time. I just couldn't wrap my head around it. But now, in hindsight, it makes perfect sense. You have a pharmacy that you're working in and not paying yourself the actual going rate. What you're saving in there sits down as profit. But when another buyer comes in and buys that business, they may have to employ a pharmacist, and therefore they have to account for this pharmacist's salary. That's going to impact your profit and loss account and the profitability of that business. This is now one of the core concepts that I help clients understand through Daughter, not just what a business is worth to them, but how to present it in a way that aligns with how the buyers think and how the banks will think. The key thing to realize here is that working in your business may help short-term cash flow, but it creates a false sense of security and inflates the perceived profitability. That's the truth. It doesn't build value, at least not in the eyes of the buyer or the valuer. Now, don't get me wrong. Sometimes you need to step back into the business. We've all had those moments. But if your goal is to build something sustainable, something that can eventually run without you, then that has to become your focus, because the truth is you won't always be there, and the business needs to function regardless. You need to build a business that works without you in it. That's what buyers value. That's what banks value. And that's when you know you've built something truly investable. For the last 5 years, we've been helping pharmacy owners at Daughter Consulting get to that point. And the pushback is always the same. Why should I pay someone for what I can do myself? And look, I get it. On paper, it sounds logical. You're a pharmacist. Why should you pay another pharmacist to do what you can do? But it goes back to your why. If your why is financial independence, flexibility, or even just the option to sell one day, then at some point you would need to step out of the business and start working on it rather than in it. Here's the truth. Anyone can be a pharmacist. Not anyone can run a business. Running a business takes a whole different skill set. You need resilience, strategic thinking, grit, adaptability, courage, leadership, and the list goes on, emotional intelligence. And once you realize that, everything changes. Because the moment your business can pay a full team, including yourself, and still make profit, that's when it becomes valuable. Until then, it's easy to overestimate the worth of your business, but the valuation process doesn't lie. And that's why understanding the fair maintainable trade and how buyers really think is absolutely essential, especially if you're planning to sell in the next few years. One of the biggest lessons I've learned, and I help clients navigate through Daughter Consulting, is that not all buyers are equal. It's not just about who offers the highest price when you're selling a pharmacy. It's about who is the most likely to complete the deal, to get over the line with the least friction within your timeline. That's really important. Here are the main types of buyers you'll come across and what to consider with each type of buyer. You get your corporate chains and multiple buyers. These buyers are typically well-funded and can move very quickly once they're serious. They negotiate hard. They may delay completion due to internal processes, and their initial interest doesn't always lead to a firm offer. You're often one of many on their radar. They're good for clean, profitable sites and standard hours with minimal complications. Secondly, you have the first-time buyers. This might be their dream pharmacy, but they can struggle with financing. The legal processes can drag as they're usually unfamiliar with change of ownership and NHS processes and so on. The advisors, solicitors, and lenders may also lack experience. If you do choose to go down this route, you'll need to be very patient, factor in extra time and hand-holding. But in return, they're often more emotionally invested in the process. Thirdly, you have your local operators and expanding independents. These are some of the best buyers, especially if they already run pharmacies in the area. They understand the local market, they know what to look for, and they're often ready to act quickly because they've done it before. They would have fitness to practice in the area, so the change of ownership application would be a lot smoother. In our Scarborough sale, our most serious buyer was a local operator, and although their offer was lower than we'd hoped, it was real, it was clean, and it completed. And finally, you've got the investor-backed buyers. This is very, very rare in pharmacy. Sometimes you get interest from non-pharmacists and investor funding. Tread very carefully with these ones. They may be chasing a return rather than understanding pharmacy dynamics. The valuations are often aggressive, but they struggle to pass due diligence. Deals can fall through late in the process with these guys. If you're considering this route, dig into their track record and make sure they have the right people around them. For me personally, my advice would be don't chase the money. Look at completion confidence, timing, whether or not the buyer truly understands the business they're walking into. You really want someone who knows what they're buying, has the right financial and legal infrastructure, and is emotionally ready to own and run the business. And don't underestimate the value of using a broker or an agent to help you find the right buyer. We used an agent for our own sale, and yes, I'd absolutely recommend it. While you can sell privately, a good agent brings serious value, street connections, exposure, wider exposure through listings, and negotiation support when it matters most. They typically charge a percentage of the sale price with a small amount upfront and the remainder paid on completion. What surprised me the most, though, is that their fees are often negotiable. I never knew this. Through Daughter Consulting, we've helped clients successfully negotiate and reduce those fees, sometimes saving tens of thousands of pounds in the process. We help pharmacy owners understand buyer psychology, how to spot serious buyers, avoid time wasters, and find the right fit for their business goals. Because here's the truth. You only get to sell the business once, and who you sell to matters. From the moment you instruct an agent to the day you hand over the keys, the process of selling a pharmacy can easily take 12 months or more. And that's being conservative. Some pharmacies stay on the market for much longer, especially if the location, financials, or market sentiments aren't right. We touched on that earlier, and it's worth repeating. Just finding a buyer is only the beginning. Once the offer is accepted, you're thrown into a legal and regulatory maze that can feel never-ending. One of the biggest surprises for us was how complex and drawn out the change of ownership process really is. It dragged on far longer than we expected, and to be honest, we didn't help ourselves. The application forms kept getting returned back. We hadn't filled them incorrectly. We started the change of ownership process after finding a buyer, but in hindsight, we should have started much earlier. Here's something many people don't realize. You can actually submit the change of ownership application at any point, even before a buyer is lined up. Nothing legally changes until you submit your notice of commencement, which is the form of 30 days notice to the NHS that the contract is changing hands. By having an approved change of ownership ready and waiting, you can dramatically reduce days. Instead of waiting 3 to 4 months for approval, you're only waiting out the 30 days notice period. That can make a real difference in keeping a buyer engaged and the sale on track. The whole process can take 3 to 4 months, and that's assuming there are no delays. When you're trying to keep momentum with a buyer, that kind of timeline can feel like a lifetime. To make matters worse, we had too many directors listed on the company, which slowed down the fitness to practice checks. Every extra person adds time, and if any of them are slow to respond, it holds the entire process up. The change of ownership isn't the only hurdle. The legal side of selling a pharmacy is a full-on operation. You'll be hit with due diligence questionnaires that can stretch 50-plus pages, covering everything from staff contracts and lease terms to service history, liabilities, and NHS claims. It's insane, honestly, and it's easy to get caught off guard if your paperwork isn't already in order. In our case, we had to scramble to find documents we hadn't looked at in years. Everything from employment contracts to NHS correspondence to waste disposal agreements. The buyer solicitors wanted it all. Every delay on your side can add pressure, raise doubts, or even trigger requests for price reductions. We learned that from experience the hard way. That experience changed how we operate, and it's something we now pass on to our daughter clients. Having a system for organizing key documents not only reduces stress, but speeds up the sale and improves buyer confidence. In fact, we've had agents and solicitors praise our responsiveness and the level of detail we provide, especially compared to the average contractor. Then there's the issue of structuring the sale. You'll need to decide between a share sale, which is where the buyer purchases the company's shares and everything within it, including the debt, an asset sale, where only specific assets of the company, like stock, goodwill, and the NHS contract are transferred, and a hive-down sale where assets are transferred into a new company that is then sold on. Each of these vehicles, as I call them, has pros and cons, their tax implications, liabilities, completion timelines, and this is where expert legal and financial advice is critical. Don't try to navigate this alone. Here are a few lessons that would have saved us time, stress, and cost. Start early. Change of ownership forms can be submitted before you even find a buyer. Get your documents in order. Leases, contracts, insurance, contracted hours, core and supplementary, and NHS services. Have a solicitor who understands pharmacy sales. Generic commercial solicitors often don't grasp the specifics that make or break deals in this sector. And finally, mentally prepare for the emotional weight, because the moment it becomes real, you'll feel it. Selling a pharmacy is not just about putting up a for sale sign. It's about getting your house in order, anticipating the buyer's questions before they're asked, and clearing the runway so that the transaction doesn't stall midair. It's hard work, but it's not impossible, and especially if you have the right support. We've supported dozens of pharmacy owners through every part of this journey, from early preparation to due diligence to buyer selection, sales structuring, and completion. If you're thinking about selling the next 1 to 2 years, we can help you get sale ready with confidence. There's a huge part of the sale process that is usually underestimated, and that's the way you manage your team through a sale. It's a sensitive one. Your team often don't understand the behind the scenes of an ownership transfer, and if handled poorly, it can create fear, spark rumors, and even lead to resignations long before the deal is done. And you don't want that. And pharmacy is a very small world. Once you start the sale process, once you've made that decision, word tends to leak. No matter how careful you are. Agents would have NDAs in place for interested buyers, but in my experience, they're barely worth the paper they're printed on. The usual suspect for spreading the news are locums and supplier delivery drivers. They work across multiple sites and often carry news from one pharmacy to another before you've even had the chance to tell your own team. So you need a plan, not just for the sale, but for the communication. There are two schools of thoughts here. You can either be fully transparent from day one, tell your team early and manage the process together, or choose to wait until the key milestones are hit, protect the deal from unnecessary noise. We chose the second approach at the time because we weren't physically present in our branches every day, which made it harder to control the narrative and answer staff questions directly. You're in branch day to day, you may prefer to go the transparency route, and that can work well too. The key is to base your decision on your specific team and your working relationship with them. There's no one-size-fits-all answer. For us, we waited until the buyer was confirmed, a sale date was agreed, and we had the key reassurances ready. And when we finally sat down with the team to explain the sale, the reaction surprised us. They were actually relieved. The emotional connection had faded, and it felt like closure for everyone involved, even for us. That said, here's an important warning. Staff loyalty and morale can influence the buyer. Some staff may leave as soon as they hear about the sale, particularly if they feel uncertain and undervalued. This can affect the buyer's confidence and raise questions during due diligence. And while your sale agreement will likely include non-poaching clauses to prevent you from encouraging staff to leave and join another branch you own, those clauses don't stop staff from leaving voluntarily or being headhunted somewhere else. It's crucial to understand your obligations under TUPE, the Transfer of Undertakings Protection of Employment Regulations. TUPE ensures that when a business is sold, the employees attached to that business transfer with their existing terms and conditions intact. That means contracted hours, salary, holiday entitlement, and benefits must be preserved. Redundancy and dismissal related to the transfer is highly restricted, and you're required to inform and consult staff about the sale and its implications. This is not optional. It's a legal requirement, but a lot of contractors don't know this, and failure to comply can result in claims against you and the buyer. Managing your team during a sale is just as important as managing the legal and financial side. You only get one chance to get the communication right, and how you handle it can set the tone for the entire transition. The goal should be a smooth handover that preserves goodwill, reduces staff anxiety, and gives the buyer confidence that they're inheriting a stable, committed team. And remember, once the sale is complete, your legacy becomes their reality. Set them up well. If I could go back and do it all over again, I'd start preparing years before the actual sale. But here's the truth. Selling a pharmacy isn't just a transition, it's a transformation. You're not just handing over keys, you're handing over staff, systems, reputation, liability, and years of hard work. And how prepared you are will determine how smooth and how profitable that handover will be. There's wisdom in building an exit strategy into your long-term business planning, but most of us don't do that. We don't plan for a rainy day, and as a result, we often find ourselves scrambling when things go wrong. But if you do plan ahead, you're less likely to be caught off guard and far more likely to avoid a rush sale and get maximum value for your business. So if you're running a pharmacy and haven't thought about an exit yet, now is the time to start. Even if you have no intention to sell anytime soon, it's never too early to prepare. Looking back, there are things I really wish I'd done earlier. 1. Prepare early, at least 2 to 3 years before selling. Although we did not have 2 to 3 years to prepare in our case, even if we did, we would not have. So I have included this one as a key lesson. I used to think when I'm ready to sell, I'll just list it. But that's a big mistake. The reality is preparing for a sale takes time to clean up finances, sort out contracts, optimize profit, and position your business well. We only started thinking like sellers once the financial pressures kicked in. That put us on the back foot and meant we didn't always sell from a position of strength. 2. Start the change of ownership process early. We waited until we had a buyer. That was a mistake. The change of ownership process can take 3 to 4 months. And because we hadn't submitted it, the whole deal got delayed. Worse still, we didn't realize we could have submitted it earlier. Had they approved and waiting, then triggered the 30-day notice of commencement once the buyer was ready. Lesson learned there was that you can and should start your change of ownership process before finding a buyer. It buys you time. The minute you decide you're selling, just start the application process. 3. Sort out contracts before you sell. One of the most painful parts of the legal process was scrambling to track down contracts we hadn't looked at in years. Waste disposals, sharps bins, HR files, equipment leases, service agreements, you name it. Some of these were outdated. Some were missing. Some were auto-renewing with no clear end date. If I had just systemized this 12 months earlier, ended or novated contracts ahead of time, it would have saved us so much time, legal back and forth and stress. 4. Understand your business from a buyer's perspective. This is really important. We assume that our private services income, prescribing and tight margins will all speak for themselves. But the buyers and the banks don't buy your best year. They buy what's maintainable without you. Our first valuation was a wake-up call. But once we understood how valuations actually work, what buyers look for, and how the fair maintainable trade is calculated, we were able to reposition the business. 18 months later, the same pharmacy was valued at nearly double, not because the business had changed, but because we had, and we presented it properly. 5. Stop draining profits through drawings. If you're thinking of selling, maximize reported profits, not personal drawings. Profit is what buyers pay for, and every pound of extra declared profit can add 3 to 6 pounds to your valuation when multiplied. It's tempting to reduce tax through drawings, but when you're prepping to sell, run your books like a buyer is watching, because they are. So if you're listening to this and even thinking about selling in the next 2 to 3 years, here's your action list. Get your book sale ready. Hire an accountant who understands pharmacy. Start paying yourself a market rate salary, or clearly account for what a new owner would have to pay someone to replace you. Clean up your HR files, leases, and service agreements. Everything should be easy to find and up to date. Start preparing for the change of ownership now. You don't need a buyer to get the application ready. Once you've made the decision to sell, submit the change of ownership application. View your business through a buyer's lens. Would you buy your own business? Don't wait until you're under pressure. The best sales happen when you're strong, not struggling. And if a friend called me tomorrow and said, I'm thinking of selling, the first question I'd ask is, why? It's always important to know the why, because knowing your why would shape the whole approach. Then I'd ask if your numbers are clean, because once due diligence starts, there's nowhere to hide. And finally, do you have support? You shouldn't go through this alone. At Daughter Consulting, we now help pharmacy owners, both buyers and sellers, navigate the entire journey from valuations, legal preps, buyer psychology, and contract. If this episode has raised questions or you just want a second opinion, please reach out to me with your questions or just drop them in the comment section. I'll be more than happy to answer them, because you only get to sell a business once, so make it count. Here are some final thoughts for me as we edge towards the end of this episode. Selling a pharmacy will test your knowledge, your systems, and your emotions. It's not easy, but with the right preparation, support, and mindset, it's absolutely doable. And finally, learn from my mistakes. Plan early and don't do it alone. So I'll repeat this. If you're listening to this and you might sell in the next 2 to 3 years, start now. Maximize profits, tidy up your accounts, and always sell from strength, not panic. And further down the line, I'll be sharing what I'd do differently if I had to build from scratch again. That's one for listeners who are just getting started, so stay tuned. After going through this journey, the highs, the lows, the delays, the tough conversations, I realized one thing: selling a pharmacy shouldn't feel like this. That's why I started Daughter Consulting, to help pharmacy owners and buyers navigate this process with their eyes wide open. We help you understand your valuation and what affects it. Get your business sale ready years in advance. Choose the right buyer, not just the first one. Systemize your legal documents, staff processes and finances, and avoid pitfalls that catch most sellers out. If you're thinking about selling, now or in the future, let's talk. Even if you don't work with Daughter, I want you to be better prepared than I was. If this episode was about process of selling, the next one digs into what happens after the sale, the emotional crash, the contracts that follow you, the lessons you only learn when it's all over. Episode 17 is titled, After the Sale, What I Learned the Hard Way and What I'd Do Differently. Don't miss it. If this episode helped you, please do 3 things. 1. Follow and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. 2. Share it with someone who might be thinking about selling or needs to hear this. And 3. Tag us on socials at _BTC Podcast and let's continue the conversation. And if you want support with selling or even just to ask some questions, reach out to me. You'll find all the links in this episode description, including how to get in touch with me or Daughter if you're planning a sale. And remember, the best prescription for success is resilience. Thank you for listening.